Hello YouTubers. Today we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you how to make a buttonhole without an attachment. So if you find that you don't have an attachment, you lost it or whatever, here's a simple buttonhole that I'll show you how to do. So let's get started. Attachments, as you know, they keep track of where the needle is and at all times, the position of the fabric, that type of thing. But obviously if you're doing something manually, you will be the one to control that. The first thing I would do is mark the fabric. If you have more than one buttonhole, I would mark the positions of each buttonhole prior. Don't do it one at a time. Mark them all out. And I'll show you how to do that now. I'm going to sharpen this up a little bit. Now remember, or if this is your first time tuning in about buttonholes, you will make the buttonhole needs to be 1.5 times the size of your button. Okay, so if your button is 1 centimeter, the buttonhole will be 1.5 centimeters long. So what we'll do is we will make one line. Let's make this simple. Let's make it 1 inch. Okay, so we'll make one line, and that will be where you're going to cut the buttonhole open. Okay, then we'll go slightly to the right, I would say maybe 1 millimeter or 2. We're going to make another line, 1 inch long. That's going to be to the right of your buttonhole. Then we're going to move slightly over to the other side and make another line. And that'll be the other side of the buttonhole. Now at the end, we'll mark where the reinforcements are going to be. So literally, I don't know if you can see it, but you're creating the lines, literally you're creating the stitching lines of the buttonhole in case you'll become more, as you become more proficient in this, you won't need the lines, but starting off I would definitely create them. Okay, my machine is threaded, and as you can see here, I have a transparent foot that allows the sewing machine needle to go back and forth, because as you probably know, when you're making a buttonhole, you'll be using the zigzag stitch to create it. So you'll need any foot that allows the needle to go back and forth. Okay, this one's is transparent, so I can see what I'm doing. Okay. Okay, so we're going to start by doing the top reinforcement, the first reinforcement. That's where we're going to start. And we'll need to tell the machine where and how we want it to stitch. Okay, so when we're making our buttonhole, we're going to need to make some adjustments. This is a Necchi Supernova machine, but all domestic sewing machines will give you the ability to adjust your zigzag stitch to where you want it to be, how wide you want it to stitch, how long you want it to stitch, and where you want it in place. So on the Necchi, we have this lever here, which places the needle where you want it to be. Sometimes you'll want the needle all the way over to the right or to the left. Sometimes you want it in the center. Sometimes you want it all the way over to the right. Now when we're doing our initial reinforcement, and actually for the last reinforcement, we want it to be in the center. It's very important that you follow these steps, okay? Over here, this is our stitch length. All machines have it, okay? For, let's say, if you're gathering, you'll want the stitch length to be high, maybe 4 or 5. But with buttonholes, we want the stitch length to be very, very small. Initially, with our first reinforcement, we're going to put it, our dial at 0, meaning that the stitch is going to sew in place. It's not going to move the fabric at all, okay? Now, right in here, let's see if we can get closer. Okay, right here, we have our tab that this controls how wide you want the stitch to be, okay? So I've noticed that for the, and it'll be, like I said, it'll be different for every machine, but for the Necchi, for our initial step, we're going to put our tab, now here's our black marker right here. We're going to put the black marker over to 3, and you'll see these little dots right underneath the number. That's where we're going to put the end of the black tab, right on that dot, okay? Move it over just a little bit. It'll be right at that dot. We're going to screw this in, screw this screw in so that it does not move, okay? We don't need to worry about the second, this one here, just the first, okay? So these are your initial placements for the first stitch. We're going to have our needle position in the center. We're going to have the width at 3, and we're going to have our placement to be at 0. Sorry, at 0, meaning that it's going to sew in place. So let's get started. And as usual, I always recommend that the take-up lever here, you put it all the way to the highest position when starting to sew, because that way your thread does not pull out. All right, so let's start. Okay, you don't need to go more than 3 or 4 times. Okay, so now we're going to make the left side of the buttonhole. Okay, so again, and when we stop our sewing, make sure that every leg of this, that you're going to, when you end your sewing, that the needle is out of the fabric, because you don't want to make adjustments on the needle position when it's still in the fabric. Okay, that can cause some damage. All right, so now we're ready for the left side. So again, we're going to make our adjustment. We're going to move our lever over to the left. Okay. Now, instead of 3 here, I've noticed that we'll make the adjustment to 1, because we want the width of the stitch to be much smaller. So you can make the adjustment on your own machine, but on the Necchi, we'll make the width I'm going to unscrew this so that it loosens up. We'll put this to 1, right against the 1. All right. And for the stitch length, okay, we don't want it to be 0 because we're not sewing in place anymore. The needle needs to travel. So you'll see the dials here. Here's 1, 2, but in the middle you have a dot. Okay, that dot, I would say, let's call it 0.5. Okay, but for a buttonhole, we need it to go even smaller. So let's go in between. Sorry, that's my phone. We'll go in between the 0 and the 0.5, so basically making it 0.25. Okay, so let's get started with our left side of our button. Okay, so we're going to follow our initial markings and just let the machine go. When we get to the end, we're going to make sure that we end with, again, the needle out of the fabric. So now we're ready to go to the third step, which is going to be the reinforcement, the second reinforcement, which is the bottom of the buttonhole. So again, we would go over and we're going to make adjustments. Now, this is a reinforcement, so the needle position we will want in the center. Okay. We're going to want the width to be wider, so we're going to put this again at 3. The length of the stitch we're going to put back on 0. Okay, so now we've finished that side. We're ready to go to the second reinforcement, but of course we're going to have to make adjustments on the machine. Okay, so once again, we want the position of the needle to be in the center. Okay. We're going to want to make adjustments here again on the stitch width. So we will go back to 3. Okay. Remember, this is the bottom of the buttonhole. Okay. And remember, we're going to make our adjustment here. We want the reinforcement to be sewn in place, so we'll put this at 0 again. Okay. Now, when you're sewing the second reinforcement, it's important. I wouldn't go over it 3 or 4 times. I would only do it maybe 2 or 3. Maybe you can do it manually by hand, because when you're making the last stitch, going back up to the first reinforcement, when you're doing that, you sometimes, if you put too many stitches on the reinforcement at the bottom, the machine has to go over a bump, which makes it skip a stitch. So let's just do this maybe 2 or 3 times. There we go. And of course we end on the outside of the fabric. So we're ready to do the last stitch, which is completing the buttonhole up to the original reinforcement. Now, it's important that you understand that when you're doing these buttonholes, do not remove the fabric from the needle from here unless you're able to put it back exactly where you had it before. That can get a little tricky until you become really proficient at this. So last leg, we're going to do the next stitch up to the original reinforcement. So we will make our adjustments again. We are doing the right side, so we want the needle position to be over to the right. Our stitch width, we want to go back to 1. And our stitch length, we're going to put back to 0.25. But since we are now sewing in reverse, we'll also have to engage our reverse button for this last leg. Okay? So make sure that's in place. Let's get started. Okay, here's our last leg. Let's go. Okay, make that last stitch. Needle is outside of the fabric, and if pulling it out is difficult, all you have to do is take your finger, just pull it in between, pull the thread out, you know, loosen it up a little bit, and then it comes right out. And then you can cut it. Here's your buttonhole, and to make your cut in the fabric, you can take a seam ripper, push it in at the very end, making sure that you're clear of the stitches, and then okay, so it's in, and then we push the point through, again, away from the stitches, okay, maybe about 1 centimeter or less. Let the seam ripper come through, making that initial hole, and then we can just take our snippet and cut the rest of the way. And there you go. Manual buttonhole.